Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the 5th episode of America Unplugged. I am your host, Manny, and today I have a very controversial topic. One that really irks me. It's not right. It's a narrative that we should stop pushing, and that is systemic racism. Now, I've had this conversation with people in the past, and shortly after the launch of my last episode regarding the Capitol Hill incident, I started coming across articles that were suggesting that the protests in DC, followed by the riot from the small group of people that got out of control at Capitol Hill, was a perfect example of systemic racism because that crowd was predominantly white. And the 2 points that were made were, if it were a different group, such as a minority group or a BLM group, that they would have been treated very differently. And that's an insane accusation to make. We know from the reports that the only reason why the riots got out of hand, again, not the protests, because a lot of people there were peacefully protesting, but among the protesters, the rioters that got out of hand, it was simply because there weren't enough law enforcement there to handle the situation. So to insinuate that it's an example of systemic racism is insane. Not everything is racist, people. The second thing is that there's this picture circulating the internet that shows these janitors that were cleaning up after the protests and the riots, and among them were some quote-unquote people of color. And that is an example of racism. They were cleaning up after the white folk. Come on. You guys are stretching big time with this whole systemic racism argument. And you are watering down the term racist by overusing it and painting every situation that doesn't go your way as racist. That's ridiculous. For the record, I hate speaking this way, using the terms that these identity politics agenda pushers use, addressing a group by their race or ethnic titles. I hate that. At the end of the day, we're all Americans, we're all people. But for the sake of this episode of the podcast, we'll go ahead and use their titles so that I can go in and attempt to debunk this whole systemic racism argument. So let's start with quote-unquote white people who fell for this ridiculous notion that they are somehow privileged and have white guilt as a result. First of all, if you consider yourself privileged, thank your parents for giving you the ideal upbringing so that you can now as an adult consider yourself privileged. It's got nothing to do with your race. Get over yourself. And this whole white guilt thing, why? Were you asked to be born white? No. Was I asked to be born Hispanic with brown skin? No. Do I think it's something that's a handicap for me? Hell no. The amount of melanin in my skin isn't a determining factor for my success. And I can only speak for myself. But let's just be real here for a second. That's a ridiculous notion. So, quote-unquote woke white people, get over yourselves. By saying that you have white privilege and white guilt, you are insinuating that a person who isn't white needs your help. So you're judging that person by the color of their skin and not the content of their character, or their capabilities, or their potential. Your intentions may be good, but very misplaced. Cut it out. Now for Hispanic and Black people that are pushing this narrative. You fall in one of two categories. Either A, you were somehow convinced by this narrative that's being pushed. In that case, I'll go ahead and give you some information in this podcast, give you some references, and I'll let you come up with your own conclusions. Stop letting these media sources and all these other different outlets do the thinking for you. The second group knows that this is complete BS. And if that's the case, you should be absolutely ashamed of yourselves. Because right there, you're taking away any accountability from the Black and Hispanic communities to do better, and you'd rather blame it on the white man. That's as ridiculous as it sounds. Seriously? You're telling me that you are in this country, the United States, incapable of making something of yourselves. You know better. But enough ranting about my personal opinions. Let me go ahead and switch over to my public health hat. Let me go ahead and put my public health hat on. And let's go ahead and dissect this step by step. So, Dr. Tricia Rose from Brown University summed up systemic racism into 5 different categories. Generational wealth and income, which in my opinion should not be used interchangeably because wealth and income are 2 different things, but I digress. Argument 2 is housing. Argument 3, education. Argument 4 is media. And argument 5, law enforcement. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into media and law enforcement because A, those 2 subjects require a podcast episode of their own, and I'd like to keep this under an hour. And B, I don't think those 2 things really apply to the economic factor of systemic racism or the argument of systemic racism, which is what I'm going to focus on today. But you already know that this entire podcast, America Unplugged, is calling out the media for the false narratives that they push. And with criminal justice or law enforcement, I think everyone knows that there are other factors outside of the entire police force being systemically racist that contributes to anything pertaining to law enforcement. So again, that requires a podcast in and of itself. So let's go ahead and transition over to the first argument, generational wealth and income. Now, the first thing that people are going to argue is the 20th century. Now, in the 20th century, there were Jim Crow, segregation laws, redlining. Now, with these redlining laws came the discriminatory practices for lending, for business loans, and more notably for houses. Literally, red lines were drawn and mapped out in different parts of each state that separated desirable and undesirable neighborhoods, and it segregated these neighborhoods by race. And the argument is that these segregation laws affect people till this day because those red line cities are still lower income, impoverished, predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So therefore, if those neighborhoods still exist with those same demographics, then it must be due to systemic racism. Well, let me tell you why that's irrelevant. A, Jim Crow laws were banned over 50 years ago, and people leave the ghettos and the projects all the time. No one's holding a gun to anyone's head and saying, you must stay here. And on top of that, the only factors that contribute towards someone purchasing a home or getting a business loan are things such as credit, debt to income ratio, job and income history, so on and so forth. We're all numbers in the system, basically. It doesn't see race. That's not a determining factor. B, one of the things that people don't know, because the agenda pushes for it being Black and Hispanics primarily, is that Jews and Asian Americans were included and affected by segregation laws as well. And yet, it's common knowledge that Jews do really well for themselves. Jewish Americans typically hold careers in law and medicine. They do really well for themselves and their communities. And Asian Americans, again, also affected by Jim Crow laws, are officially the highest earning group in the country. So why is it that 2 of the primary groups affected by Jim Crow laws are now doing well for themselves now? There are a number of factors. But we know that systemic racism isn't a factor. Now, what about generational wealth? Another argument is that due to these red line laws and segregation laws, people weren't able to buy houses in desirable neighborhoods and therefore accumulate wealth that can be passed on from generation to generation. Well, the National Study of Millionaires, which is the largest study ever conducted in the country for millionaires, over 10,000 people surveyed, showed that 79% of the participants received no inheritance, 21% received some inheritance, 3% received an inheritance of $1 million or more, and 2% came from an upper income family. Let that sink in. 98% of millionaires did not even come from a rich family. They had humble beginnings. Why? Because this is the land of opportunity. So, I'll, again, link all this information so that you can pull it up yourself. You can find it in the description section of this podcast. Moving right along, argument number 2, housing. Now, housing, I'm not going to dive deep into because I already mentioned different parts of housing with the Jim Crow laws. It's tied very close to wealth management. And again, I'll just say that while there were discriminatory practices set in place over 50 years ago, today's factors are things such as credit score, debt-to-income ratio, job and income history. There is nothing pertaining to race in there. It's not like you go into a bank and they look at the color of your skin and they can legally deny you. No, that doesn't happen. We are all numbers in a system. So, moving right along to argument number 3, education. There is a big educational gap in this country when you're looking at it by race or ethnic group. The extreme left will tell you that this must be due to racism, except the data shows otherwise. For example, a study in New York showed that students in the same schools and classes still learned at different rates despite having the same educational opportunity. The white kids in the same classes were learning better than the black and Hispanics in those classes. They had the same resources, they had the same instructor, they went to the same school at the same time. Also, according to the US Census Bureau, second-generation Americans, that means children of immigrants, also have higher education levels than their peers. So, with over 20 million people assessed by the US Census Bureau, 20 million second-generation Americans specifically, it showed that they had higher incomes than their peers. They had higher rates of college graduates than their peers. They had higher rates of home ownership than their peers. And they had a much lower rate of poverty than their peers. And to top it off, among the highest level of educated people in the US are Nigerians, literally the highest educated race or ethnic group in the country. So if the US was in fact systemically racist, then it would equally discriminate against any person of color. But that doesn't seem to be the case. We can't keep stamping things with a racist label simply because there are disparities or things don't go in someone's favor. That's not the way things work. And what really irritates me about these agendas, these narratives that are being pushed, is that they look at one piece of the puzzle and they come up with this conclusion, rather than looking at the whole pie and trying to see what factors all contribute to this complex problem. It's not as simple as it must be that this country is racist. Really? Then tell me how people from the West Indies, who most people wouldn't be able to generally differentiate from African Americans, still get higher levels of education and perform better in school and get higher earning jobs than African Americans. Specifically, people from the West Indies who are second generation Americans. Same thing with Nigerians. How come they're among the highest educated? How come Asians, who were also affected by Jim Crow laws and are considered a minority group, the highest earners in this country? But no, America must be racist with white people, specifically the white man being the evildoer who is oppressing everyone. That's a dangerous thought process with no backing whatsoever to support that claim. Now, back to the economic portion. It is true that there is a vicious poverty cycle. So if you live in a poor area, you have lower property values. Lower property values equals lower property taxes. Lower property taxes equals lower school funding, since schools primarily get their funding from property taxes. Lower school funding equals lower education levels. Lower education levels equal lower educated adults. Lower educated adults equal lower income earners. Therefore, the probability of being in poverty is much higher. Rinse and repeat. It becomes a vicious cycle. But a key point is that that is not exclusive to people of color. That affects everyone. Poverty affects every single country and affects every single race or ethnic group. Poverty does not know race. Poverty does not know color. Poverty isn't predetermined based off of the amount of melanin in your skin. Now, if we're looking at the numbers in America as a whole, not taking into account race or ethnic groups, just America as a whole, if we're looking at a pure numbers game, white people have almost double the amount of people in poverty than black people. Are those people privileged? Do those people have it better off than black people do? Would you make the argument that a white person living in a trailer park is still more privileged than a black middle class family? The whole notion that someone has an easier life or a better life than you based off of the color of their skin is inherently racist and completely and utterly ridiculous. Anyways, not to circle back to that topic, let's go ahead and go back though to the New York study for students who were learning at different rates. There was a key indicator that separated the better learners from the children who were falling behind. The kids who performed better, yes, predominantly white, but who performed better, came from an $80,000 plus annual household income. And the kids who fell behind, who were, yes, predominantly black and Hispanic, came from a $30,000 or less annual income household. Now, why is that relevant? Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with socioeconomic status. As I mentioned before, poverty does not discriminate based on race. Every country, every race or ethnic group suffers from poverty to a certain extent. So, on the topic of poverty, since this is purely focused on the economic portion of the systemic racism argument, anyone who is interested in diving deeper into the statistics for poverty and the psychology behind it, I recommend you pick up the book, A Framework for Understanding Poverty by Dr. Ruby Payne. It gives you an in-depth analysis. It gives you a breakdown of poverty, including the different types of poverty. So I want to clarify, Dr. Ruby Payne mentions two different types of poverty: situational and generational. Situational is self-explanatory. A person or a family who otherwise is not in poverty finds themselves in a situation to where they are in poverty, usually temporarily. It could be the primary breadwinner gets into an accident and is unable to work. Therefore, if he or she can't work, then they can't bring home income. They find themselves in poverty. Generational poverty is when a family or an individual has been in poverty for at least 2 generations or more. Therefore, that becomes a way of life. Show you why that's relevant in a second. Now, Dr. Ruby Payne also further dives into the different socioeconomic classes, because again, this is what this boils down to, socioeconomic class. And she iterates that each class has unspoken rules that the class below them does not know or usually is not aware of. So we all know there's the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. And as an example, let's use the middle class. What are some of the typical things? Not for every single middle class individual or household, but as a general rule of thumb, they value traditional families, they value higher education, wealth accumulation methods, and they know of ways of achieving them, right? They know about purchasing homes and building equity. They know about 401ks, IRAs, stocks, options, the whole nine, and how to use them to achieve their financial goals. They also know how to manage their money, right? Whereas if you go to the class below them, the lower class, these things may not be things that each individual is aware of, and the majority of people aren't aware of it. They usually come from broken homes, divorced or separated parents, single moms. They live paycheck to paycheck. Money is meant to be spent, not managed. Education is usually not prioritized. It's a nice thought, but usually not prioritized. Now, why is this significant? Well, because this is the key, or these are the keys to breaking the poverty cycle. A lack of knowledge and how to apply these tools to play this economic game, because that's what it boils down to, it's an economic game, is what's plaguing the lower socioeconomic class today. And again, this is irrespective of race. There are plenty of white people that fall within this category and have those same habits and mindsets. It's just unfortunate that a significant portion of blacks and Hispanics find themselves in that lower socioeconomic bracket. But that is not indicative of systemic racism. That's an indication that these people lack the knowledge and the resources to apply in their lives in order to break out of poverty. It's not the government's job. That's treading dangerous territory, and I'll get into that later on. Back to the whole poverty argument. So if the three economic arguments for systemic racism are irrelevant, wealth/income, housing, and education, then what drives the breaking of the wealth gap? Well, it's the same thing that drives any form of change, your mindset and your behaviors. You have to change your mindset first, and then you change your behaviors in order to have a desired outcome. Now, think a bit deeper now. What influences someone's mindset and their behaviors? Culture. Now, culture is purposely vague to cover a broad variety of things that can influence someone's life, their perspectives, most specific, their mindsets and their behavior. So moving forward, to save myself a breath, I'll just refer to the wealth and income, education, and homeownership gaps as poverty moving forward, okay? Let's go ahead and combine these two things. How do poverty and culture mix to create the issues that minorities are facing today? And again, not just minorities, this affects white people as well. Now, in an economic sense, people who are in generational poverty, remember, poverty that's been within 2 or more generations, tend to repeat the same poor financial habits that they've always known and that their parents have known, possibly their grandparents. Now, with culture, this boils down to what people value and prioritize in their lives. Think about that for a second. The culture that you submerge yourself in, the things that you dedicate your time and attention to, and your energy and your focus are the things that you prioritize. Problem is that in many cases, the things that we prioritize often do not serve in our best interest in order to get the best quality life that we can get. Remember the examples that I used for the middle and lower class families, or middle and lower class socioeconomic classes? That's all in pursuit of status. For example, with the middle class, people get a higher education. That's driven by status. They get credentials. Again, status. A prestigious career. Status. What's one of the questions someone asks when you first meet them? Oh, what do you do? Accumulated wealth. Again, status. Status serves as a huge motivator for most humans. It's a way to stand out in the crowd, be more noticeable, be more desirable, right? Be unique. So, middle class, those are some of the typical things found in pursuit of status, what people value, right? And within a lower class, what are some of the things that, if you have grown up lower class, what are some of the things that you've witnessed? Street cred, right? Who you know, who you with, can you fight, right? Again, from my first podcast, I'm not going to pretend that I grew up in Southside Chicago or Baltimore, but we definitely had our fair share of fights, gangs, there were drugs. We grew up in that gangster rap culture. Let's pretend those things don't exist, right? That those don't play a factor, a huge factor in what minority groups prioritize. Anyways, not to go off topic. So with both classes, there is a certain level of materialism. You know, humans are inherently materialistic in some way, shape, or form. It's in many cases terrible, but again, that's a topic for a whole other podcast pertaining to consumerism. Anyway, so both classes do have their forms of materialism. Middle class, I'm sure everyone's heard of keeping up with the Joneses. Getting that nice 2-story house. That fancy fast sports car, right? Speedboat, the 12-foot bass boat. Your neighbor's got a new boat, you got to get one bigger than them. What about the lower class? Again, as a personal anecdote, people valued expensive clothes. How many of you grew up and J's were a thing? People who were otherwise on welfare were walking around wearing $200 pair of J's and gold pieces and expensive clothes. Oh man, what were some of the ones? Pepe jeans, rocking a pair of Tims or J's. when I was in middle school, FUBU, all these ridiculously expensive clothes. What else? Music. I know that I wanted to be a rapper and a reggaeton artist when I was a teenager. I didn't prioritize education. A lot of my friends didn't prioritize education. We all wanted to make it big, being rap artists, reggaetoneros, making music. And I don't want to overly critique that because there are pluses to that. I mean, those things brought about unthinkable levels of creativity. But for many people, it was a trade-off to prioritize those things over learning the skills and the tools needed to break out of poverty. And this was in my neighborhood, and arguably in many of the impoverished neighborhoods it's the same way. And there is a dark side of music too. If you just listen to gangster rap, or if you listen to the nonsense that people are ingesting isn't just for food. What are you taking in general? What kind of music are you listening to? What kind of movies are you watching? What kind of media are you following? All that has an impact whether you think so or not. At a subconscious level, it all affects you. And so when you have certain artists making overly sexually explicit videos, how impressionable do you think those things are to the younger communities? To the easily influenced teenagers who think that value is found in those misguided things, right? Which again, is a major factor when it comes to the prevalence of STDs in minority communities. And even bigger issue is broken households, fatherless homes, single mom homes. Within these impoverished communities, we value the wrong things. Meanwhile, middle class communities, the traditional family, both mom and dad are there, and poverty rates are significantly lower. Children receive a higher education, a higher quality of life, a healthy household with both mom and dad there. And again, that's a topic for a whole other podcast. The point being, it all boils down to what we value in our culture and our socioeconomic brackets. I'm just speaking what I know. I can present the data to you, which I will, especially with the broken households. I'll link some sources on that. And all that boils down to people valuing the wrong things. And so if the lower socioeconomic class were to learn the tools and have the resources and the knowledge and acquire the skills needed to break out of poverty, they'd be much better off. We're getting down to the grassroots issues, and the grassroots issues are the norms and what people value and their social circles, because everyone is in pursuit of status. So of course, in your neighborhood, in your block, in your hood, if no one knows a damn thing about wealth tools and everyone's so caught up in what pair of J's you're wearing and the jeans you're wearing, some dude down the block tries you, so you gotta put him in his place. If that's your way of seeking status, then of course you're not gonna break out of that. And if that's something that's been going on for more than one generation or two or more generations, that's the norm within your social circle. The people you surround yourself with, if they're like-minded, they're going to reinforce these things. And again, don't forget about the external factors. The music you listen to, social media, the movies and shows you watch. Learn the tools and acquire the knowledge to break out of that. I get it. I'm not going to pretend like I grew up in Southside Chicago, but I get that the hardships are real. I'm not trying to take away from that. That's not my intention. I get that sometimes you have to associate yourself with certain people just to be safe. You got to be part of a crew. But do what you can to get out. People have done it. People do it all the time. No one's trying to take away from your hardship. But don't for 1 second think that it's due to a systemically racist country. That's not the case. That's not true. Here's one thing I want you to take away from this entire thing. The road to success is different for everyone. Some people have bumpier roads, some people have hillier roads, some people just have a quick and easy straight path. But in this country, at least the road is there. Not many other countries have that opportunity. In this country, you do. Because no one's oppressing you. The white man isn't out to get you. I already gave some solutions, but like I aim to do in every podcast, my intention isn't only to critique, it's to provide solutions. So, do better and be better. That's number one. Only compare yourself to yourself. Don't worry about who's doing what. Keep your plans to yourself. Plan and execute. Don't flaunt it. Don't compare yourself again to anyone else, especially anyone on social media. Just do you. There's a reason why, other than disconnected Hollywood celebrities, most successful Black and Hispanic people think systemic racism is BS. Why? Because they have made it in this country and no one held them back. Learn a new trade or skill. Get educated. Learn about financial tools used to build wealth. Manage your spending habits. Watch what you ingest. Pay attention to the music and the entertainment that you expose yourself to. Change your social circle if you have to. Get out of there. If kids are your goal, also see the importance of a traditional family. Stop sleeping around. Ladies, stop thinking that your value comes with what's in between your legs. Take that seriously. Don't be a single mom. Your child is much more susceptible to poverty. You are much more susceptible to poverty. You're much more susceptible to STDs. Children are a great responsibility. Be careful who you open yourself up to. You have more value than that. You have more worth than that. If some dude is trying to tell you or trying to pressure you into sleeping with them and you want to do it to keep him around, it's not for you. And fellas, stop putting sex on a pedestal. It's not supposed to be some kind of competition of how many women you can sleep around with, because the consequences are huge if you're having unprotected sex. When you put children in the picture, that's inexcusable. Stop prioritizing that. Be responsible. And if there's a huge thing that I need to emphasize for the Black and Hispanic communities, get out of the welfare state. Get out of government assistance. Do what you can to not rely on the government. They do not care about you. Stop relying on them for help. That system is meant to keep you poor and segregated. Progress is a disincentive for people in welfare. That means that you are covered with your basic needs: housing, clothing, food, so long as you don't make past a certain dollar amount. The moment you do, you lose all those benefits. That's nerve-wracking for anyone. No one wants to lose the roof over their heads or the food on their table. And in terms of segregation, familiarize yourself with how HUD works. So people get housing vouchers to cover their housing needs if they fall under a certain income bracket. But the government reimburses landlords for the housing. Not all landlords are going to open up their housing for affordable housing, for the vouchers. So what happens typically is that these housing vouchers are only good in certain areas. That's where the segregation comes in. That's what the far left is pushing for and advocating for. By being in a welfare state, you're only segregating yourselves. It has nothing to do with red line laws. That's irrelevant today. Segregation comes through government assistance. They don't care about you. Get out of that as soon as you can. Become self-sustaining. And on top of it serving as a deterrent to improving your life, government welfare programs also incentivize poor decision making. What do I mean by that? Having children out of wedlock. You have things such as child support, food assistance increases, cash allowance increases by having more kids and marrying the government. Don't trade quality of life, especially for your kids, for a government paycheck, because it's a vicious cycle that repeats itself. And just because you're getting a few extra $100 from the government monthly doesn't mean that your kids will be better off. Look at the statistics. If there's one more point that I want to make about the government not caring about you, regardless of race, but the far left government is the one pushing this agenda as if they care about you. They don't. Take a second to look at how highly they think of you. Pay attention to who they get to endorse them as candidates. It's not scholars. It's not the intellectual people. They get these promiscuous, flamboyant artists that have no relevance whatsoever when it comes to politics or socioeconomic status or helping the overall minority communities to publicly endorse them. How is that not insulting? No scholars, no people of remotely high intelligence. That's how highly they think of you. You are just as capable as anyone else to make something of yourself in this country. There's no systemic racism. Stop victimizing yourself and stop teaching your kids that too. Because you are literally acting like a toddler, throwing a tantrum, hoping that he or she gets his or her way and the parents will enable them. Sometimes people just need a smack to reality, a reality check. Kicking and screaming isn't going to make you get your way, especially when it's at the expense of others. You can do better. I also want to cover one more thing, and that is the dangers of letting the government take over this whole systemic racism agenda and politicizing it. That is extremely, extremely dangerous, to have the government, quote unquote, try to uplift people of color because they are somehow being oppressed to systemic racism. Why? Well, let's get to the root of it. This is a page directly out of Marxist ideology. The oppressed versus the oppressor argument. Because if you have a group that's oppressed, then there must be another group oppressing them. What does that sound like? People of color and white people. You have white guilt and white privilege, and you have people of color. Systemic racism, right? So Karl Marx, co-author of the Communist Manifesto, and where a lot of these equality and socialist oppressed versus oppressor ideologies come from, he believed in a utopian dream where there was an equality of outcome. What does that sound like to you? Pay attention to what politicians are saying today about equality. President-elect Joe Biden just said, what was it, a couple days ago? That they're going to have efforts to uplift the minority communities, Black, Hispanics, Asians, and women. In the words of Matt Walsh, he could have saved himself a breath or two by saying we're not going to help white men. I mean, he went to the whole list and excluded that. Now, this is dangerous because the government is determining who needs to be uplifted and who needs to be knocked down a few pegs. This is called tyranny, folks. Because when you draw a line of equality, just in your head right now, draw a line of equality, right? And in that line, you'll have people of color, minority communities, that sit under that line. So the goal is to lift them up, right? What they don't tell you is that there are going to be the overachievers, in this case, white people, who are sitting above the equality line. In order for them to meet at that equality line, you have to bring the overachievers down. That is, by definition, oppression. The government is getting directly involved, or at least they plan to get directly involved in determining people's outcomes based off of the color of their skin. In essence, they're going to combat systemic racism by being systemically racist. Now, if you think this won't happen, it's already happened through means of affirmative action, which again, I'm highly against. Because affirmative action looks at someone's race or ethnic background rather than their qualifications to determine whether a company or organization is going to hire them or not. If you have two candidates equally qualified, or possibly even one is more qualified than the other, and one is white and one is someone who's Black or Hispanic, guess who is going to get hired? You are taking actions and making decisions based off of someone's skin color. That is inherently racist no matter how you spin it. Consider the fact that Harvard also was under a lawsuit, with the case being titled Student for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, in which Asian American Harvard applicants for their undergraduate programs filed a lawsuit against Harvard because they said that affirmative action was hurting their admission rates, and that if Harvard were to base their admissions process based off of test scores, that Asian Americans would have a higher population within the Harvard school communities. And yet that's not the case because of affirmative action. Unfortunately, the judge did not rule in the favor of the Asian Americans who try to apply to Harvard's undergraduate program, which again is very concerning. Dr. Martin Luther King said that he had a dream where his children will grow up where people were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So tell me why it is appropriate in today's world for people of color to judge and attempt to oppress white people. Oh, but they're well off. You don't know that. As I've proven, poverty does not know skin color. Every race and ethnic group has a certain percentage of people that fall within that poverty line or below it. It's terrible that we've come to this and that this narrative is being pushed. And me personally, it doesn't sit right with me, knowing that my skin color can be a determining factor that'll give me an edge over someone else. Never mind the work that I put into being the best qualified candidate for anything that I'm going to apply myself to. Never mind the years of schooling. Never mind the hardships that I overcame. And not to make it about me, I'm just speaking purely anecdotal. When I had this conversation with one of my friends in the past, I was literally called a traitor, which is sad because I'm one of those second generation immigrants or second generation Americans that they refer to in the study. My parents are from the Dominican Republic. I was born and raised here in this great country, the United States. And anyone who knows a bit of Dominican history knows that Dominicans were the first slaves in the Americas. And we also had a dictator named Rafael Trujillo who wanted to lighten the Dominican race. And so he offered sanctuary to European immigrants who came and lightened the race. And if you look at the outskirts of, Dominican Republic, not the main city, although in the main cities as well, you will see that most of the population is still predominantly black. But in my opinion, it's important to know history, yes, but it's dangerous to conflate the past with current events. And as irrelevant as someone may find Dominican history to be pertaining to the United States, is the same way I present the argument that segregation and Jim Crow has absolutely no impact on someone's ability to make something of themselves in this country. Slavery, it's atrocious. But in this country, though it's an important piece of history that we can never forget, it's not something that is holding anyone back today, unless they choose for it to. Prejudice, same thing. There are no systems in place that are going to hold you back because of the color of your skin. So hopefully, if you weren't aware of that, I can only hope that you have a better understanding on my stance as to why systemic racism is completely irrelevant. And I encourage you as a listener, if you aren't doing so already, to look beyond skin color and realize that we are all Americans. Stop letting these false narratives further divide us. And we're all people just trying to get to this thing called life. There's no such thing as systemic racism. There's no such thing as white privilege. Stop believing this agenda that's being pushed. And certainly do not believe politicians that are pushing this. You're not a victim. Life is hard. Figure it out. And be grateful that you live in this great country. Anyways, thank you for tuning in. This is the America Unplugged podcast. And I'm sure that we will have plenty more conversations about this. I'm sure I've missed a few key points, but it'll open up opportunity for further discussion. I'm your host, Manny, and I'm signing out.